Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is David Daoud, Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. David, thank you so much for joining me.
Pleasure's all mine. Nice to see you, Brittany.
There is some breaking news this Wednesday. Israel and Hamas have reached a hostage release and ceasefire deal after over a year of fighting. So first, to begin the conversation, what is your reaction to the historic announcement?
I mean, it's mixed feelings for me because on the one hand, hostage release is important. These people, these innocent people who were taken from their homes, have been held in Gaza with contact with their families, with no update on their status for over a year. And God knows what horrors they've been subjected to. We can only imagine that an organization like Hamas has no respect for human rights and has no respect for the rights of captives. So securing the release of some of those hostages, at least it's going to happen in phases, is a positive thing. At the same time, this is the dilemma that Hamas tried to put Israel in from the outset, that to secure the release of the hostages, Israel would have to cease fighting prematurely against the organization, which would allow it, at the bare minimum, to begin redeploying in Gaza in more advantageous positions. But in the longer run, start the long process of reconstituting itself and threatening Israel again in the future.
I want to talk about exactly what is in this agreement because it's broken down into three phases, and some of them span across what's happening immediately to then what's happening in later weeks. So can you break down the three phases for us?
Okay. So there will be hostage releases in several phases. This is kind of almost a confidence building measure. There will be IDF redeployment out of certain areas in Gaza. There will be certain times during the day. I think there's a 10-hour break where no IDF surveillance, either aerial surveillance or Gaza, will be permitted. And this is probably to allow Hamas to move freely in the area, not allow the Israelis to track Hamas's movements. Also, during the times where Hamas will be released, this will prevent Israel from seeing where the hostages are held and act unilaterally to release the hostages and perhaps renege on the ceasefire deal or abandon the ceasefire deal. In tandem, Hamas security prisoners will be released. Some of them will be as the deal says, women and children. I'm not sure exactly. These are most likely security detainees, not innocent women and children, but also people, as Israel calls them, with blood on their hands. Now, some of those will be deported, others won't. There was a question up until the last minute about what the IDF's presence would be on the Philadelphia corridor. This is the area of the Gaza Strip that links to Egypt. There's also the opening of all border crossings. The deal stipulates that all border crossings will be open to free movement of goods and individuals, whatever that means. Obviously, this has been going to be a sticking point for the Israelis, given their 20-plus year or almost 20-year blockade, rather, on the Gaza Strip to prevent Hamas from obtaining the materiel, the weapons, the means necessary to build weapons. So we'll see what that's going to look like moving forward.
There's a lot to look out for, but we've been at a place before throughout the 15 months where Hamas and Israel entered negotiations, were at the table talking, and then those negotiations, those talks broke down. What made these specific talks different this time around?
Well, that's a good question because in a lot of ways, and this is something that some analysts have highlighted, the deal that has been achieved now is not that fundamentally different from the one that was on the table in May. Several factors may have led to both sides being willing to make more concessions. On Hamas's side, its critical ally Hezbollah is down for the count, not entirely out, right? They're in a recovery process. The situation in Lebanon is now very complicated, but they're no longer on the support front. They're no longer fighting in support of Hamas. Iran has taken a blow. Hamas itself is further degraded. It's months out. We're 8 months now, if I'm not correct, if I'm not mistaken, out from May. So all the degradation that has been inflicted upon Hamas's military infrastructure has been compounded. And then there's the incoming Trump administration. Right, incoming President Trump has made it very clear that there will be hell to pay if the hostages aren't released. And this reminds me in some ways of of Ronald Reagan coming into office after the Iranian hostage crisis, where they were held for 40, American diplomats were held for 444 days. Until Ronald Reagan, who had issued threats against the Iranians, took office, and then they were released. So that could be a factor. On the Israeli side, I think the Trump factor is also weighing on them. President Trump has made it clear he wants peace and quiet. He wants to get back to the business of deal making. There are also domestic factors. There's pressure from hostage families, from big swaths of the public, to achieve a ceasefire deal, to get the hostages released. And let's not forget, the IDF is an army comprised of human beings and not robots. IDF doctrine stipulates or at least is designed for quick, powerful campaigns, not something that's dragged out for now almost a year and a half. So the army needs some time to rest, recuperate, take care of wounded. So all these factors are coming together, I think, to put pressure on both sides to accept a deal that just a few months ago, an almost identical deal, was not acceptable.
I want to dive a little deeper into the Trump factor here, the Trump element, because as you noted, he said before that essentially all hell would break loose should Hamas not release the hostages by January 20th. And today in a press conference, President Biden said this, quote, "This deal was developed and negotiated under my administration, but its terms will be implemented for the most part by the next administration. In these past few days, we've been speaking as one team." So how instrumental do you think the Trump team, Donald Trump himself, and his Middle East envoy were in getting this deal across the line?
It seems like they were a critical part of it. I mean, some of the Trump team were in the Middle East negotiating. I know the Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump have a good relationship. So I imagine that they had a very critical role in getting this deal past the finish line. I mean, Trump was the one to announce it almost, and on his Twitter account. So I imagine he wasn't just sitting back. The Biden administration, knowing that their days are numbered, because Trump is set to take office within a week now, if I'm not mistaken. If my math is 5 days, if my math. Right, you're going to have the incoming administration on board and not just apprised of the situation after the ceasefire deal is inked. They have to be part of the process. They can't be excluded. So I think from the outset, the Trump administration or the incoming Trump administration's team, they had the trust of both sides, or at least one of the sides, the threats on the other side, and the cooperation of the Biden administration.
To your point, this comes at a really interesting time. 5 days until Trump is sworn in. President Biden is still in office. This deal technically got done in his last remaining days in office, but both presidents we've seen since the news of the deal broke have been taking credit for it. And President-elect Trump posted this, quote, "This epic ceasefire agreement could have only happened as a result of our historic victory in November, as it signaled to the entire world that my administration would seek peace and negotiate deals to ensure the safety of all Americans and our allies." And a reporter at the end of the Biden press conference asked him, "Who gets credit for the deal, you or Trump?" And he turned around and asked the reporter, "Is that a joke?" So what do you think about each president trying to take some credit here?
I mean, it's natural, right? That's part of politics, and everyone's going to say, this is my legacy. Everyone wants to spin this as there's a lot of celebration that's going on, and I think it's misplaced celebration. I think in time we'll look back and see that this deal was premature and a mistake. But right now there's celebration, and the business of politics is to take credit for good things. I would say failure is an orphan, but success has a thousand claimants. So I think, of course, there's going to be President Biden wants to secure his legacy. President Trump is all about his legacy and his accomplishments. Only natural.
You have mixed feelings about this, and I want to talk to you about a comment that the FDD's founder told me just a few days ago, because I feel lucky. Ever since October 2023, the FDD has talked to us and has given insights about this conflict each step of the way. And when these ceasefire talks were in the final stages, he told me, "I think people are getting confused. Ceasefire does not equal peace." Can you talk about that in the terms and context of this agreement we have?
So look, technically speaking, that's correct. A ceasefire does not take you back to the status quo antebellum. If we're talking from a legal perspective, put on my lawyer's hat here for a second. A ceasefire, it does not take you back to a point where according to most scholars at least, where you would have to commit what's called an armed attack, an act of violence of sufficient magnitude to justify the victim going to or launching a war. The terms that govern the continuation of a ceasefire are the terms of the deal itself. Think of it as a contract. If you and I have a contract and one of us violates it, the other can engage in self-help measures. You go to the court, so on and so forth. In the case of a ceasefire deal, if one side reneges on one of the terms, and that failure constitutes a serious violation of the ceasefire deal, especially if it's the crux of what the deal is supposed to be about, the other side is theoretically entitled to go back to resume hostilities at full force. They don't need to suffer an armed attack prior to that. Now that's the legal technicality. As we know, law tends to rub up against practicality and reality more often than not, and it's very difficult, right? There's a 42-day ceasefire put into effect. It's very difficult after you've returned people to quiet. During those 42 days, people may return to their homes in the Gaza envelope on the Israeli side, may begin to resume their normal lives, may begin to rebuild the lives, the homes that were destroyed, the lives that were shattered by this war, by Hamas's incursion. It's very difficult to tell people after that point to transition back to war, especially when you're a figure like Prime Minister Netanyahu, whose credibility among the Israeli public has been seriously eroded even prior to October 7th. The judicial overhaul that his government began in November 22 made him unpopular among large swaths of the Israeli public. The failure to preempt or prevent the October 7th attacks, we haven't even begun to see Israeli public's anger at the Netanyahu government. So you have this failure. You have this prime minister's legitimacy has been put into question by his own government's own actions, compounded by the failure of October 7th, compounded with the inconclusiveness of the Gaza war, and a similar inconclusive, at least from the Israeli perspective, an inconclusive conflict when it comes to Hezbollah and Lebanon. It's going to be a hard sell for Prime Minister Netanyahu to ask the Israeli public, let's go back to war. Then add to that, because Israel is not the United States, it can't make war as freely as the United States would want to, meaning just on the basis of legality. There's going to be pressure from international partners. The United States, not least of them. Again, we think there are a lot of people who think that with the incoming Trump administration, it's going to be a green light for Israeli action. Not necessarily so. The Trump administration has said they want quiet, they want peace and quiet, they want this thing done. Yes, President Trump has said he wants it done right, but he said he wants it done. So all of that together may impede Israel's ability to go back to war, irrespective of the fact that this is not going to peace. A ceasefire is not peace.
When you think about the past 15 months and you look at the landscape in the Middle East, it has changed dramatically since October 6th, 2023, before the October 7th attack, until now. So when you're thinking about, from the United States' perspective, Donald Trump will be back in office in 5 days. How does our relationship with the key players in the Middle East, like Iran, like Israel, change in light of this agreement and after the past 15 months?
I think it depends on what posture we assume under the incoming Trump administration. Yes, of course, there's a tragedy that happened on October 7th. The war in Gaza, any war, is a tragedy. But there are also opportunities. What the Israelis have done over the past year and a half is create an opening for the shattering of the resistance axis, the arms of the Iranian expansionist project in the region. We saw kind of a glimpse of this with the downfall of Bashar al-Assad in Syria within 11 days. Now, that's also a different question what will happen in Syria. I'm not necessarily optimistic there either. But there are openings. Hezbollah is at the weakest it's been perhaps since its inception. Hamas has definitely taken a beating that it has never experienced in its entire history. So there are opportunities if we continue to press on our adversaries and ensure that they can't exploit any relaxation on our part, any taking the foot off the gas on our part, to begin the slow work of reconstruction. Because if we just assume that these adversaries, Iran and its proxies, are just going to take the L, if you will, take the loss and just accept it and come to a modus vivendi either with Israel or with the United States, where there are red lines that are drawn and they respect those red lines, then we don't understand our adversaries. They will take any opening to begin the long game of reconstitution to resume the threat that they once posed to Israel and U.S. interests in the region. So we need to continue pressing, and it really depends. What happens next really depends on what posture we take.
Well, there's certainly a lot to look out for. And David, per usual, I appreciate your insights. I appreciate your expertise. Thank you so much for joining me.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.